At first, they scratched with a pointed reed, but then they found that if they made the reed wedge-shaped, they could incise the clay more efficiently with one stroke.
And that is why their writing is called cuneiform, from the Latin cunea, meaning wedge.
How many symbols do you think they had to learn in order to write?
Somewhere around 1,000.
1,000, and we have 26. No wonder they had to have a profession devoted to writing only.
Yes, scribes they were called, and it was a very important profession too, especially as the rulers were illiterate. The few who could write were so proud of their accomplishment that they even boasted about it. Now that the Sumerians had writing, what did they write about?
Ever write a laundry list? That's what they wrote. Lists, lists and more lists. Lists of livestock, lists of measures of grain, lists of kings, lists of conquest of kings. They also kept records and wrote contracts. When a contract was drawn up, it was signed with a seal.
These seals were the credit mark of a merchant or businessman or lady of property. They were cylindrical and often worn around the neck. If they were lost or stolen, word was sent out that they were no longer valid from the date of their loss.
Just like our credit cards.
Plus ça change, plus c'est la même chose.
Later on, as the scribes became wealthy, they could take time to write about what interested them.
Ninmay Shara U Dala Ea Mizi Melam Guru Ki Angaan.
Queen of all, resplendent light, righteous woman clothed in radiance, beloved of heaven and earth. My lady, you are all devouring in your power. The great gods fled before you like fluttering bats, could not stand before your awesome face. Who can soothe your angry heart? Knowing, wise, queen of all lands, who multiplies living, I have uttered your holy song. Enheduanna, a Sumerian princess and scribe, wrote that hymn to the goddess Inanna 5,000 years ago.
The cuneiform script became so popular that a few hundred years later it was used to record in other languages. Akkadian became the diplomatic language, and even the Egyptians used it.
And what were the Egyptians doing while Sumer was growing?
Building pyramids, of course.
Of course, but they were doing far more than that.
Egypt seems to be a classic case of settlement in a riverbed, cultivation of crops, domestication of animals, building of cities with temples prominent and many gods and goddesses. Trade with neighbors and inventions galore, art and architecture and writing.
In the next program, we'll explore Egypt in greater depth. For now, we'll just note that Egypt traded with and made war on her neighbors, just as everyone else was doing, from a position of safety denied to most of them.
Let's move across the Atlantic to what we now call Central America and apply our formula to what made civilization begin there.
It's not quite a classic case. There was no great river basin, but a low-lying coastal marshy region with an abundant rainfall. About the time that Sumer was inventing writing, the Olmecs, as we call the first settlers, inhabited the coast and grew corn, peppers, beans, pumpkins, and had domesticated the wild turkey and dogs.
One thing that was quite different about the peoples of Central America was their isolation. They were cut off on the other side of the world, and as far as we know had no contact with either Europe or Asia. The Olmecs have been called the mother culture of Mesoamerica, and it was they who probably invented the long calendar and writing. The Olmecs were followed by the people of Teotihuacan.
Following our formula, they built huge pyramids to their gods at Teotihuacan, which turned into a trade and cultural center, and was supported by fields of crops watered by a sophisticated irrigation system. Teotihuacan lies just outside Mexico City today.
Further south, another race of people developed in the same way, the Mayas.
They built their tall pyramids, sculpted their statues, drew their artwork, invented a calendar, and recorded the movements of stars in a writing which has been almost completely deciphered.
And their temple complexes were cities supported by an agricultural economy.
We've moved along in time to about 2,000 years ago. Let's go back now to 7,000 years ago and have a look at northern China.
Here we have a familiar situation, a river valley and settlements growing up near a water source, an economy based on millet, pig, and dog.
First settlement is called Ban Po. Archaeologists have been excavating for years, but there is still a wealth of information under the earth yet to be revealed. Chinese civilization developed differently from the civilizations of the Near East. Legendary rulers were credited with giving the people agriculture and medicine, silk making and the domestication of animals, and flood control. Their worship was of ancestors and the spirits of nature.
Their historical periods were measured in dynasties, and it is with the great bronze-making dynasty of Shang that we begin our glimpse of their civilization.
3,500 years ago, the Shang dynasty had a large city at Anyang, used a developed script, and left us evidence of themselves by burying their possessions with them in tombs.
Including their servants and slaves, both male and female.
Archaeologists are very grateful for this custom, as we should be. We'll see in every program how most of our information about ancient civilizations comes to us from these burial places. We'll be exploring the civilizations of Central America and China in more detail later on in the series. Now it's time to move on.
India and the river Indus Valley follow our criteria almost to the letter. A most extraordinary civilization grew up on the banks of the Indus in what is Pakistan today. At Mohenjo-Daro, the city was surrounded by fields, giving them a constant food supply of grain, which they stored in one of their chief buildings, the granary.
Their walls were of fired brick. Their main streets were well engineered. Drainage and sewage ran off in underground conduits. Water was drawn from wells, and their two-storied houses had bathing rooms, outside of which was an exterior stairway. This may have permitted a servant to give the householder a personal shower.
Water seems to have played a great part in their ritual. There was a huge bath in the center of the city which had to be filled by hand. We have no idea of what form of cleansing, spiritual and/or material, went on there.
One thing is clear, this dancing girl is happy enough.
And the female figurines seem to point to goddess worship.
Early archaeologists identified this figure as a priest, but he may simply have been an important official or a ruler. We can only speculate because their writing has not yet been deciphered.
There seems to be plenty of work for archaeologists, or in this case, linguists.
Want a job, anyone?
And what happened to them and their sophisticated culture?
We'll see in the last program. Now, we're going back to Sumer.
We should explain that the area containing the Sumerian city-states was called Sumer, and was not a country with boundaries as we know it. To the north was an area called Akkad. These two areas were conquered by and became Babylonia. To the north of them was an area called Assyria.
These groups of people were constantly at war, both with each other and also inside their own lands.
Especially Assyria. Everyone had to be in the army there. Their society was a war machine.
The only city which did not involve itself in war was Nippur, a religious center worshipping the goddess Inanna, to which all the city-states came to settle their disputes.
Our United Nations.
Sort of.
But that didn't stop them cutting off the water supply to the next city down the river so they could move in and take over its wealth.
It's probably why they became such good engineers and built such intricate irrigation systems.
What did they do for relaxation?
They had their great festivals, which sometimes went on for days, and for which they dressed up in their finery. Jewelry and makeup were worn by men and women, if we are to believe the evidence of some of the grave findings. They used files, tweezers, perfume, and makeup jars.
Their culture didn't allow for the leisure that we take for granted. Theirs was essentially a farming community, and most of the people were farmers, working all the daylight hours.
Their craftspeople and merchants, however, made up what we might call a middle class, and their professionals were doctors, scribes, and architects. At the highest level were priests and priestesses, kings and queens.
Their doctors always attended in pairs, one to give advice based on what he'd learned about medicines, and there was a long list of them.
And the other to magic the disease away by supernatural means, and he or she had an impressive list of spells.
Science and religion in harmony.
Their clothes are interesting. They seem to have favored a sort of grass skirt. Later, when they understood how to make cloth, the skirt became long for both women and men. A royal grave can yield treasures, such as those of Queen Puabi at Ur. Headdress and jewelry of exquisite workmanship. A golden goat climbing a tree. The harp, decorated with a bull's head, tells us what her favorite music must have been.
Storytelling was one of the entertainments at court, and the bards or poets who told the tales were looked on with respect, and always accompanied themselves with a lyre or harp.
Later, these stories became myths and were written down, and we can still read them.
Gilgamesh was a hero like the Greek Heracles, who became the Roman Hercules. He had the most exotic adventures while looking for the secret of immortal life.
And the Enuma Elish is a wonderful account of the creation of the world, with great battles between forces of good and evil, gods and goddesses and human beings.
What happened to the Sumerians?
Watch the last program to see how the search for food developed into some of the most sophisticated economies the world has yet seen.
Be with us next time, when we'll start with Egypt.